The History of the Future Museum is the second part of Star Trek The Experience, and it's a museum that's broken down into the following sections. When you first walk up the ramp of the Museum of the Future, you come across models of spaceships. For example, we have an actual model of a lunar excursion module used during the Apollo missions of the 1969 to 72 time period. We got a piece of lunar rock there. Whether it's real or not, I'm not sure. And then we begin the display of props and artifacts. For example, this is the servo pen used in the second season episode Assignment to Earth from Star Trek the Original Series. Moving on, we come across a model of the early NASA space probes. And then we have a vintage space shuttle. In this case, it's the Space Shuttle Enterprise. And then we have a model of the Phoenix, which is the warp ship that Zefram Cochrane piloted in the motion picture Star Trek First Contact, and broke the warp barrier, alerting the Vulcans to Earth's presence. Now, opposite those models that you just saw is a gigantic backlit display of the Star Trek timeline, containing both factual and fictional accounts in Star Trek lore. I'll show you just a few brief snippets to show you what I mean. For example, we have something here commemorating Galileo's invention of the telescope. Now, this is a real historical fact. And of course, here we have Neil Armstrong's footprint on the moon, another historical fact.
Do it again. Long ways.
Now, here, for example, is a fictional account in the history of the timeline. This is Zefram Cochrane's. Actually, this is just Zefram Cochrane himself, circa 2053. And of course, in 2063, Zefram Cochrane makes his historic flight, breaking the warp barrier, alerting Vulcans to Earth's presence. Here we have the early missions of Enterprise NX-01, circa 2151. Moving along further, we get now into the original series era, circa 2265. Now here we get into some classic stuff from Star Trek, the original series. For example, here is Kirk and Spock's journey into the Guardian of Forever, or as comic book guy from The Simpsons would say,
the worst episode ever.
And speaking of City on the Edge of Forever, here is a replica of the computer that Spock built in the 1930s, using nothing more than the equivalent of stone knives and bearskins. And a good close-up shot of the computer, complete with tricorder coming into view from the left. In this part of the timeline, we now get to the motion picture era of the Star Trek franchise. You can see V'ger in the center bottom with the refitted Enterprise in the upper top part of the screen. Here we have the events of Star Treks 2 and 3. The death of Captain Spock, for example. The Enterprise is destroyed as seen in the events of Star Trek 3. And here we have Chancellor Gorkon to the far left and General Chang upper right. The events of the film Star Trek 6, The Undiscovered Country. Moving further still, we now get to the modern era of the Star Trek shows. This part of the timeline shows the various events of the major characters from Star Trek Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager. It's too complicated really to show it in all of its glory. But you get the picture, folks. Here we have some notable events of the early seasons of Star Trek The Next Generation. For example, here, Q puts humanity on trial for being a grievously savage species. Here, the Enterprise first encounters a Borg cube, later to become one of the most nefarious villains in Star Trek history. And of course, 1 year later, after their first encounter, Captain Picard himself is assimilated by the Borg and becomes known as the Cutis of Borg. Moving way further down, we start getting into the Deep Space Nine era of the Star Trek universe. And then here we get into the Voyager era of the Star Trek universe. Now here is another backlit display of all the starships named Enterprise, starting with the NX class Enterprise all the way to the Sovereign class Enterprise. This is the graphic display for the NX class Starship Enterprise. And actually to the right is Zephyr Cochrane's warped vessel, the Phoenix. This is perhaps arguably the most famous starship to bear the name Enterprise, the Constitution class under the command of both Captains Christopher Pike and James T. Kirk. Though seen only once, in Star Trek Next Generation, we have the Ambassador class Starship Enterprise C. In this display, we can see on the right-hand side the Constitution class refit Enterprise A and the Excelsior class Starship Enterprise B on the left-hand side. Then, of course, we get to the Enterprise 1701D Galaxy class starship under the command of Captain Jean-Luc Picard. And finally, we end with the Sovereign class Starship Enterprise NCC 1701E. This backlit panel shows a few other starship classes. From top to bottom, we have the Constellation class quadruple nacelle starship. Center right is the Miranda class starship, of which the USS Reliant was probably the best well known. And then we have the Oberth class starship, featured in Star Trek III Search for Spock, the USS Grissom to be precise. This display has the various types of shuttlecraft in use in the Star Trek universe. And of course we have Deep Space Nine, formerly known as Terok Nor, under the Cardassian jurisdiction. And finally we have the Starship Voyager, Intrepid class starship. A video montage of various starships. This is the view from the back end of the experience. You can see right up there is that gigantic model of the Galaxy class Enterprise. In the distance is actually the part of the casino of the Vegas Hilton. The back end, the Starship Voyager. And so forth.